Hi everyone, welcome to What I Knit in 2025. I completed 15 knit projects and 5 spinning projects. So we're gonna go through all of those in chronological order, and I'm also going to tell you what each item cost me. In the past, I've been pretty stat heavy, but instead of running through a ton of numbers this year, I have included some superlatives that I will call out as I go through projects. So my most worn knit, my favorite project, my most knit designer, my most disappointing project. And I'll start with my very first finished object, which was a beanie. This is the Harlow hat by Andrea Mallory, but it is not the Harlow flip because that hadn't come out yet. So my brim is the reverse side. I knit this out of Handspun yarn that I had finished at the end of 2024. And I cast this on for the Spin to Knit Harlow Cal that Into the Third, Madison Montees, and Claire from Purlwise were hosting. I cast this on January 1st and I bound it off on the 20th. So this took me 19 days, and I'm estimating the fiber that I spun this out of cost me around $20. This was using some leftovers, and if I'm remembering everything correctly, that's about what I spent on this. And this was 163 yards of knitting. Now I have to start off on a bit of a bummer because this is my least favorite spinning project. There's something about the colors as well as the size maybe of the beanie that I just don't love, and I haven't worn this out of the house. Maybe I'm being a little bit harsh, but I just don't feel great when I wear this, and so I always opt for a different beanie if I'm gonna wear one. But I did really enjoy spinning for it and the knitting process. So this was much more about the process for me, and for that, I had a lot of fun making this. I just don't see myself wearing it. Next is a sweater. This is the Bonebone by W Knit Work for Ami Risu. I cast this on January 15th and I bound it off on the 27th. So this was a very quick knit. It's a bulky sweater. It was really fun to work on. So this spent 12 days as a whip. I knit this out of Cascade Eco Plus Merino, which was my first time working with that yarn. It's in the color Ink Blue. I knit the extra small, and I really love how this sweater turned out. I don't wear it a ton because I'm not a huge lace person, but I'd had this pattern in my queue for a really long time, and I had also had the yarn for it. I bought this yarn specifically for this project a couple of years ago, and so I just wanted to start the year by clearing out my queue. I loved knitting this pattern. It's very well written, and all of the details are super nice and well thought out. There is this ribbing panel on both of the sides, and I think that this just looks so nice with the lace stitch pattern. I also love the way the underarm is worked, and so this rib column meets in a triangle. The back has this garter stitch section that flows nicely into the garter stitch shoulders, as well as this knit column that's left when you pick up and knit the sleeves. So everything about this just feels very high end to me. I did not get a ton of wear out of this, and I think it's mostly because of the lace pattern. I'm not a huge lace person, even though I do really like this. I would say maybe this is a little bit more on the mesh end than pure lace. But I think I just have a hard time finding something to wear under it that I like. I've worn it with just a plain black shirt beneath it, and I think it's fine. I don't love the way it looks, but it works for being able to wear it. But I think if I improve my styling with this, I would wear this more often because I think it is just a very nice sweater. I spent $55 on this, which I think is really good for a full sweater. And I'm including partial skeins. So the Cascade Eco Plus Merino skeins are huge. So I only needed to buy 2 of them, but I would say I only used about half of the second skein. And so when I'm using a partial skein like that, I'm just going to count that entire skein as part of the cost, since I had to spend that to knit the project. But obviously I won't include skeins if I overbought and I ended up not needing them. And my total yardage for this project was 685 yards. So it's a very quick knit, but I highly recommend this pattern. My next FO is the sweater that I'm wearing. This is a really fun fade sweater. It is a compound raglan that I self-drafted / improvised. I had bought this advent set, this mini skein set from Tanis Fiber Arts, because I just loved these colors. I loved how it starts with this bright bubblegum pink and it ends in this gorgeous, subtly variegated dark blue with like purples and greens. I just really, really liked all of these colors, and I wanted to knit just a plain sweater to show off the fade. This was my very first fade project, so I had to look up how to fade one skein into the other, and I ended up using a combination of a couple different methods. I think I used Andrea Mowry's and Summer Lee's fading instructions, and I just kind of mashed those together to do something that I thought looked nice. I just realized that I'm wearing this on the knit side out, but I actually intended to wear it on the purl side out, although it is technically reversible, but I'm gonna switch it out and show you what the other side looks like. Okay, this is the way that I intended for it to be worn. I am a fan of reverse stockinette in a fade, but obviously it works either way. The reason that I self-drafted this is I just had a very specific sweater in mind for this fade set. I knew I wanted a compound raglan so that it would fit me well, especially in the chest area. Raglans can be a little bit weird about the way that they fit, and so I'm quite happy with the way this one fits me. I did short row shaping on the back, and the hardest part I think about this was just trying to get the fade right, to know how many rounds I should knit of each mini skein so that the length would be what I wanted it. And I would say that I did knit this a little bit too long for my preference. The body is a little bit too long and the sleeves are a little bit too short. As I wear this sweater, the sleeves do ride up and they sit more at this length, and I'm not a fan of that, so I am kind of constantly pulling my sleeves down as I wear this sweater. I've also only worn it a couple of times. This was really about the process for me. It's funny, I had 2 process projects this year because I am fully a product knitter. I'm not a process knitter, but I guess at the start of the year, I was just having fun knitting stuff for the process of it all. Another little detail about this sweater is the raglan increases. So I just did a little bit of rib here. I just thought that was fun. And then I carried that down the body. So both sets of increases on the front and the back are carried all the way down the body. And then it flows into the 1x1 rib at the hem. I cast this on January 30th and I finished it February 27th, which makes this the fastest fingering weight sweater I've ever knit at 28 days as a whip. I remember really enjoying knitting this. I loved the yarn and the colors. It was really fun to come up with the shaping to try to match my body perfectly. I just had a lot of fun with this, and I do really like the finished object as well. It's just not something that I am going to wear in my day-to-day life, but I think especially wearing it to yarn stores or other yarn events, it's really fun because people obviously recognize it as a hand knit sweater. This was my first time working with Tanis Fiber Arts yarn, and I do really like the pure wash. It is a type of superwash that is supposed to be a little bit more environmentally friendly than the classic superwash process. I think it feels quite similarly to superwash, maybe a little bit less plasticky. So for that reason, I do like this yarn, but it does pill pretty badly. I've only worn this a couple of times, and it's already like, I'm not sure how well you can really see that on camera, but it's definitely pilling under the arms, on the sides of the body, as well as just kind of like other random spots that I wouldn't necessarily expect to be pilling, having only worn this a couple of times. So for that reason, I don't know if I would repurchase the yarn, but I do feel like I got it at a pretty good price. So the set that I purchased came with a full-size skein that I didn't use for this sweater. So excluding that full-size skein, the mini set cost me $130, which for a hand-dyed fade set, where I think the fade is done really well and the skeins fade into the other really nicely, that seems pretty reasonably priced to me. And this is the project that I have deemed my most fun to knit, because it definitely was. And this was my highest yardage project. I knit 1,394 yards into this sweater. My next FO is staying on theme with the bright highlighter colors. This is my one and only Musselburgh hat that I knit this year. I've knit several of these in past years. This is, of course, the pattern by Isolde Teague. And this was also the only whip that I carried from 2024. So I started this in July 2024 on the 6th to be exact. And I bound this off on February 28th of 2025. So this was a whip for 237 days, which makes sense because this is just endless stockinette in the round. So this was my mindless project that I took with me and just picked up whenever I had a few minutes. I knit this in Cascade Heritage in the color Highlighter Yellow. This is just a superwash merino nylon blend. It's a very basic yarn. It's pretty inexpensive. I spent $11.50 on this skein and I used up the entire skein. I knit the adult medium size, which I find with a fingering weight yarn, using the smallest gauge that's in the pattern, I find that size to be pretty good for me. That can be kind of the hardest part about the Musselburgh hat, or just beanies in general for me, is like getting the size right. So now that I have locked this in as a beanie size that I like, I'll just sort of cast one of these on whenever I need a mindless project. And this is a total of 402 yards. So pretty much the full skein. Next is my most disappointing knit, which I will explain because I am on the record of saying I really like this sweater, and I do still like it. It's not that I dislike it, but it is my most disappointing because I kind of expected something different with this sweater, and that is my Oon by November Knits. I knit this out of Knitting for Olive Heavy Merino in the color Blood Orange. It is a beautiful color. I like this yarn. I don't know that this yarn was the best pairing for this project, which I will explain what I mean by that. I do still wear this sweater. This is one of my most worn sweaters. It's not the most worn, but it's up there. So I do still really like this sweater, but there are a couple of things that I wish worked out better than they did. So I cast this on February 27th and I bound it off May 3rd, which means that this was a whip for 65 days, which is pretty average for me for a sweater, I would say. And if you haven't seen the Oon, this is a raglan sweater. It's got this rib detail in the increases, which clearly was a bit of a moment for me in 2025. And the kind of most striking part of this design is that the bottom hem is this really long rib and it is split up the side. It also has really big sleeves. I think you do a couple of decreases for the sleeve, but you pretty much just knit them straight. And it also has this folded over ribbed collar, which does look nice, but it is a little bit too big for me. This sweater has left me pretty confused about what I could have done differently. As I mentioned, I don't think this was the best yarn for this project. I think the yarn, the heavy merino, is a little bit too crispy for this sweater. It needs a little bit more weight and more drape. So I think if I would have held this with a mohair, that could have done it, which is what the pattern calls for, to be fair. It calls for a DK weight held with a fluffy lace strand. So that's on me for making that decision to just knit it in a worsted weight. But now that I've knit it, I realize that the bottom especially, it just doesn't drape the way that I would like it to. After I have worn it and washed it, that's helped it become a little bit drapier. But especially when I first bound this off and I tried to wear it, I found that the ribbing, like the hem, kind of cinched in a little bit in the front and the back, and it just didn't look very nice. I also find, like I said, the neckline to be a little bit too wide. I may try to add an elastic band. I know some people have done that, and that kind of can help cinch it, or at least like keep it at this size so it doesn't continue to stretch out. So I may try that. But I've also noticed as I wear it that the raglan depth, or the yoke depth, is so deep and it feels like I knit the wrong size. And maybe I did. I knit the size 3, which is about 48.5 inches at the bust. And I think the pattern calls for 25 to 30 centimeters. So at the high end, that's almost 12 inches of positive ease. And I would say that my bust is maybe 38, anywhere from like 37 to 39 inches, like depending on, I don't know, like what bra I'm wearing. So I feel like I stayed within the range that the pattern called for. But when I wear this, it just feels a little bit sloppier than I want it to. I've also learned that I don't love these big sleeves. I think they can look nice, but practically for everyday wear, I'm just not a huge fan of them. They also tend to like ride up, plus I knit them a little bit too short for me. I have kind of long arms, and I just followed the pattern and I tried it on and I thought the sleeve length was right, but they ended up being a little bit too short. So if I wear a shirt under this, the sleeves almost always show beneath this like big sleeve, and I just don't like the way that looks. I'm almost tempted to revisit this pattern because I feel like I made a couple of decisions that I ended up not liking, and so I wonder what it could be if I knit it out of a different yarn, if I maybe go down a size, maybe modify the sleeves a little bit. I'm not sure. I like a bishop sleeve quite a bit, but I've just learned that, I don't know, something about this shape of a sleeve is not my favorite on myself, but maybe I just need to knit it a little bit longer. I do have an extra skein of this, so I really could add some length to the sleeves and see if that fixes that issue. And I've also learned maybe I'm just not a huge fan of a really deep raglan yoke. I obviously knit a more fitted raglan yoke for myself with this sweater, and there's something about the way this lays on my body, or rather doesn't lay on my body, that I am not a fan of. I did take this photo the other day as I was wearing it. I'm sitting down on the couch, so I'm kind of like slouching, and that obviously makes this problem worse. But I felt like it kind of illustrated what can happen with this sweater as I am just going about my daily life, you know, sitting down, standing, moving around. This is what tends to happen, where the collar will kind of droop down and the raglan yoke will also like scrunch all up. And I just don't think that it looks very nice. So I don't know. This was my most disappointing because I had very high hopes for this sweater. I was really excited to make it. I had planned it for a while. I love this color and I do like this yarn. I am quite a fan of the Knitting for Olive Heavy Merino. I am going to be knitting another sweater out of it. I just don't think that this was the right yarn for this project. And again, that's on me because the pattern calls for holding it with a lace weight, something that will be much drapier than what I got. Oh, I forgot to mention, I did make a modification accidentally. I ended up carrying the Raglan increase ribbing down the bottom of the body, like in this stockinette part. I think because I had done that on this sweater, I just assumed that that was part of the sweater, but it's not. This part is supposed to be all stockinette. And so when I got to the part where I split the hem, the ribbing didn't match up and I was very confused, and that's what prompted me to notice in the pattern that there's not supposed to be ribbing here. So I just did a couple of decreases to ensure that the ribbing matches up with the hem. And I ended up kind of liking that as a design feature. I spent $84 on the yarn for this sweater, which is like not too bad, or maybe a little bit more standard for how much I typically spend on a sweater. And this was 1,086 yards knit. Okay, now we are getting into the spring and summer knits. I knit the Penta Pullover by James & Watts. I knit this out of Lang Linello in the color Roses, which is a really fun pink and orange and this like light sage green color. You can kind of see the theme here. These are colors that I like quite a bit. I'm usually not a huge pink person, but I really leaned into that this year. This tee is my most interesting construction because it's a really, really cool pattern. You knit these panels back and forth down, and then you knit the next ones onto one. So you get it started and then you pick up stitches and knit the next panel and connect it at the same time. So you're not knitting a lot of panels and then seaming them together. You are knitting them together as you go. It's a really cool construction. It is so well designed. It's an amazing pattern. I really, really liked knitting this, especially with the color changing yarn. Obviously, you could just knit each panel as its own color, but I really like how the panels change as they are worked. And here is the back. I cast this on May 5th and I finished it June 9th. So this took me 36 days to knit, and in the middle of that, I took 2 trips, and I did take this with me, so I worked on it a little bit, but I would say this top was pretty quick to knit. I also changed the gauge of this pattern. Lang Yarns Linello is a worsted weight online, but it's really much closer to a sport or a fingering if you look at the yardage per grams. I'm not sure why they classify it as a worsted weight. I don't know if that is a mistake or if it is just a very thin worsted weight, but anyway, I ended up changing the gauge. So I knit the large to get the size small. I bought 3 skeins of the Lang Linello at a local yarn shop while I was traveling, and I spent $57.60 on this project, and this is a total of 728 yards. This also falls under my favorite yarn of the year. I already have another sweater quantity of this yarn in a different colorway because I just really liked it. It is fairly rough feeling. It's not one of those yarns that really softens up as you wear it, at least not in my experience. And it also is very slubby, so you can see the texture there. So those are 2 characteristics that you may or may not like about it. But I found this to be pretty cool to wear in the summer. I wouldn't wear it on like a 100-degree day, but I think even in like the 80s, I would be fairly comfortable wearing this. Plus the fact that we can have a color changing yarn with such bright colors in a cotton linen blend is really exciting. So this is what I'm deeming my favorite yarn of the year. This next project is another double superlative. This is my favorite spinning project of the year. These are the DRK Everyday Socks, and Andrew Mallory ended up being my most knit designer once again. She was last year, I can't remember. I don't think she was the year before, but I just tend to knit a lot of her basics, and so she usually ends up being my top designer. This was the second time that I spun yarn for socks, and this was part of the 3-ply 2 ways cal that Andrea Mowry was hosting. This was a really fun experiment. It was my first time doing something like this, and I will talk about the yarn and how I spun it after. But I cast these on April 17th, and I bound them off June 25th, so they spent 69 days as a whip. Kind of a long time for a pair of socks, but sometimes socks and other small projects like this are just my mindless project that I keep on hand. These are 60 stitches, and they ended up being a little bit too big. The yarn that I spun is a 3-ply, and I was aiming for a 3-ply fingering weight, but that is a little bit tricky for me. I spun as thin as I can, I would say, and they still ended up being a little thick. So I wish that I would have gone down maybe a size or 2 on the socks. Here's the other one. You can compare them. They ended up being like fairly similar, like more similar, I would say, than I expected them to be, but still different, obviously. The fiber that I spun with cost me $20, and these ended up being 180 yards knit as a pair. So for the spinning, this was a braid from Hello Yarn in the color Lowering Skies, and I started spinning April 11th. I finished on the 13th, so this took me 2 days to spin the yarn. And as the name implies, 3-ply 2 ways, you spin a 3-ply yarn from the same braid in 2 different ways. One skein is a heathered ply, so I just followed what Andrea Mowry did. She used the parallel drafting technique to get a much more blended heathered yarn than you would if you maybe just spun end to end. And then the other yarn is a chain ply. So that is where you're seeing the color changes up the sock. And I have more information on my Ravelry Handspun project page about how I prepped the fiber for that. And so you can read more about that. But this was just a very fun experiment. The socks were really fun to knit because I couldn't wait to see how my yarn was going to knit up. So this was definitely my favorite spinning project. Next is another spinning project, and I forgot to include this in my knit stack. I take a photo of my knit stack every year, and there's always an item that I forget or something I can't include because it was a gift. So I guess this was the item this year. But this is another skein that I spun in 2025, and I spun it specifically for this project. So this is, again, the Harlow by Andrea Mowry. It is not the Harlow Flip. I think that maybe came out by the time I cast this on, but I already had the Harlow fingering weight version, so I just modified it to be a worsted weight hat. And I knit it in single color brioche, so the flip part didn't matter because it's just gonna look the same when I flip it up. I started it on March 15th and I finished it June 30th. So this took me 107 days. I think there were a few trips in there, and I also just wasn't working on it consecutively. To modify the pattern, I cast on 72 stitches, and then I just knit single color brioche and followed the decreases. Yeah, I think there's only one set of decreases. Maybe, I know there's a couple different sizes in that pattern, but I think the crown decreases are the same. So I was just able to follow the decrease instructions despite not having the right amount of stitches. And this hat turned out really cute. I spent $22 on the fiber, and this is 180 yards knit. And some more information on the spinning. This was a Nest Fiber Club braid. It is Rambouillet. It's in the color Love Spell. It was her January 2025 colorway. I started spinning it February 21st. I finished on the 4th, so it took me 11 days to spin this yarn. It is a 3-ply worsted weight, about 9 wraps per inch. And my sort of experiment with this spinning project was just to try to spin a worsted weight because I had never spun anything that thick before. And I really like how the 3-ply turned out. This was such a fun color. And again, keeping with the pink for 2025. Next is the wildest thing that I have ever knit, instigated by my partner. He wanted a very chunky, bulky sweater, and he really liked my traveler hoodie that I knit last year. It is by far the heaviest sweater that I've ever knit. It is like 1,600 grams. It's so heavy. It is 3 strands of worsted weight held together. Here's the hood. The hood is a little bit massive. I do have a project vlog on this, or at least of me finishing the sweater, and I talk through a lot of what went into the making of this sweater, including this massive hood, because when I first knit it, it was too small and it looked really stupid. And then I overcorrected and I knit it too big. Although I will say when it's on, it doesn't necessarily look too big. So it really just, like, proportionally it works. But when you look at just the hood, it's like this massive thing. So I knit this using 2 strands of Cascade 220, just in the colorway black, and a single strand of Manos del Uruguay Alegria Grande in the colorway Hirachi. We went through so many different colorways, different types of yarn, different iterations of this before we settled on this. He wanted a black base with a rainbow color throughout. And at first we tried to find a yarn that fit that description, but we eventually settled on this Hirachi color that he really liked, and just holding that together with black. And after all of that, it turned out really nice. This is an honorable mention for my favorite knitting project because I did have a lot of fun making this. Obviously, I converted the pattern to a bulky weight and kind of took liberties with it. I just knit it in plain stockinette. I didn't do the garter stitch type ridges because that just felt very busy with how colorful and busy the yarn is. And then I also added a pocket, like a kangaroo pouch pocket, and I knit this in reverse stockinette because I just thought it would be fun to like break up the rest of the yarn. And I think that turned out nice. I contemplated doing the pocket in just plain black, and I kind of wish I would have just done that, but I made the decision to do it in reverse stockinette, and it did turn out nice, and my partner really likes it, and that's what matters. And that is why it's an honorable mention as my favorite project, because I just really like making stuff for him. And he's always very involved in the process of making it and in choosing the yarn and the pattern. We had a lot of try-ons, and he was kind of there with me every step of the way. So it's always a fun collaboration of sorts when I make him something, because it kind of feels like we are working on it together in a way. I cast this on April 4th and I finished it June 30th. So it took me a little bit longer than I expected to, given that this is a super bulky yarn. It took me 87 days to knit this. This was also my most expensive item. I spent $260 on this yarn. And it could be worse. It could be worse, but that is not the price that I typically spend on sweaters for myself. But I was just happy to buy anything that he really liked, and this is what he ended up choosing. And it all worked out. This is like the biggest thing ever though. Like, it is so ridiculous. And this ended up being 1,425 yards knit, and that includes holding those 3 strands as a single strand, so I'm not like tripling that yardage. All right, how are we doing? We are over halfway through the year at this point, so we're making progress. Next up are my Focus Friend socks, and I call them that because I knit these using the Focus Friend app. I have a whole video on that. I knit these in a week, so I cast them on August 20th. I bound them off on the 27th, and I used Schopelwohl Zauberball in this really fun gradient colorway. It is 2134, and I tried to match them up, and I think it mostly worked. They're not exactly the same, but they're pretty close. This is using the Fleegle's Toe Up Socks pattern by Susan Glinert Stevens. And this pattern started me down a path of experimenting with the Fleegle heel, which I will get into. But I love the Fleegle heel because it works perfectly for color changing yarn like this. Really, any yarn. It doesn't break up the yarn very much, and it keeps the color change intact. These are 60 stitches, which is what I typically do for socks for myself. This yarn cost me $25, and the yards knit is 253. Next is another James & Watts pattern. This is the Lace Raglan. It's going to be kind of hard to see in this view, but I will obviously show me wearing it how I would typically wear it. This is a fun little lace top, and I said at the start of this video I'm not really a lace person, but I did knit 2 lace garments this year, so maybe I'm wrong about that. But I knit this out of Juniper Moon Farm Summer Solstice in the color Midnight Sun, and this is a really cool yarn. It is a linen, cotton, I think viscose blend, but it's tweed, which is something new for me, so I thought it just looked really cool in this pattern. I knit the size medium, which gave me about 5 inches of positive ease, and I think I could have gone up one more size. This fits me really well. I just wanted a little bit more of an oversized look, I think. The reason I say I think is that this is another raglan that has a pretty deep yoke. I was a little bit surprised by how deep this yoke is. So like, this is the yoke in between my fingers. It's very deep. So if I went up a size, this maybe would be too deep for me, and maybe I did knit the right size. I was hoping for just a little bit more room in the body, but I don't know, maybe I wouldn't like it if I knit the size up. This is a pretty cropped tee, but I did lengthen it. I made several modifications to this tee. That is all on my Ravelry project page. I don't always put notes in Ravelry, like as far as what I modified and like how the knitting process went for me, because I talk about all of that on here. And so it's like doubling up for me to write it all out. But I did write it out for this pattern because I felt like that would be helpful. I also used up every inch of yarn. I bought 2 skeins of this yarn for a total of $40, and this took me 46 days to knit. I cast this on July 13th and I finished it August 28th. I really like this top. Once you get through the yoke, it is pretty smooth sailing. The stitch pattern is one that you can quite easily read your knitting, so you don't have to constantly reference the pattern. It did, I remember, trip me up a little bit at the start. I was really paying close attention to the pattern, but once I got the hang of it, I realized it's like not difficult at all. This was 490 yards, and one little cute thing I did that I didn't show on my channel yet is I've started adding these little tags to the back on sweaters where it's a little bit difficult to tell the back from the front. This one, I guess it's not too difficult to tell. It does have short rows, which I think is something that James Watts added to the pattern. So if you purchased it when it first came out, it didn't have short rows then, but he did go back and add them, so the fit is pretty good. But I guess occasionally I was having a hard time telling the front from the back, so I just put this little tag. It's just a piece of yarn, but this one, the way that I put it in, it looks like a little heart, and I thought that was really cute. Next is the first vest that I have ever knit. This also happens to be my most worn item of the year. It was a little close, but I think I wore this like 1 or 2 more times than some of the other things that I knit. This is the Burgos vest by Rosa Pomar. I knit this all from scraps and stash yarn as one of my bingo projects, trying to hit some goals for the year. And I ended up really, really liking it. I held all of the scraps with a strand of mohair. It was some Knit Picks Aloft that I had in stash. And I went on a journey with this. I have a couple videos on it, but I really was unsure about the colors when I started it, but it has ended up being something that I do wear quite often. And maybe that's just because I realized I am a vest person. I'm not sure why it took me so long to knit a vest, but I do really like them. And this designer has also become my new favorite designer because I loved knitting this pattern. It was such a pleasant pattern. I had never knit a Rosa Pomar pattern before, but I definitely want to knit more. She has quite a few really cute vests, so I will consider that. But the way that this pattern was written just worked with my brain really well, and I just found it to be really nice. So I knit the size 2, and I held fingering or sport weight double with the strand of mohair to get the gauge. I started this August 15th. I cast it off September 25th, so this took me 41 days to knit. I'm actually not including the cost of this because it was all either scraps, most of it was scraps, and then there were a couple skeins that I had in my stash, like the mohair, and I had a couple of Rowan felted tweed skeins that I used in this, but most of it was partial skeins that I didn't even really remember what they were. And instead of trying to really guesstimate what this actually cost me, I just decided that because it's such a scrappy project, I would not include this in my cost for this year. Oh, and this was 784 yards. The last sweater of the year is another tee. This is my Hunger Games tee. So I knit this using the Aros pattern by Petite Knit. It's a pattern that I had knit before. I just think it works well with stripes. It is like this saddle shoulder style sleeve. I did modify it to have folded hems instead of ribbed hems. I used a combination of Cascade cotton socks and Sandnes Garn 10 Lena, and I modified the gauge of this pattern. So I knit an extra large to fit as a medium. I started this July 3rd and I finished it September 26th. So this one took me 85 days. And that is because while I knit this, I reread the Hunger Games trilogy and I also watched all of the movies. And I have a whole vlog on that if you want to watch it. This one was a little bit pricey for a tee because I had so many colors and I purchased all of this for this project. So I have a lot of leftovers, but in total the yarn cost me $74 and this was 745 yards of knitting. All right, this next project is what I am calling my favorite knitting project because it is the socks that I knit to figure out the Reverse Fleegle Heel, which is a pattern that I published this year. And I'm calling them my favorite because this really got me back in the mood to do some designing. I haven't written a pattern in years and hadn't really felt a desire to for a long time, but I'm starting to revisit the idea of maybe designing some knitting patterns. I don't have any concrete ideas yet, but this was just really fun to work on. If you've knit the Fleegle Heel, you know that it is a toe-up pattern, and I could not find a cuff-down version. There is the Strong Heel, which actually came before the Fleegle Heel, and people will say that that is the cuff-down version of the Fleegle Heel, but it's actually not the same shape. If you look at both the Fleegle Heel and the Strong Heel, you'll notice that this line, this short row line here, doesn't bisect the heel in the same way. But if you look at the toe up version, and you compare, these are exactly the same shape, just knit different directions. This was a really fun challenge to figure out. When I first started trying to figure it out, I wasn't really sure if it was actually possible. And then I was like, of course it's possible. Like, of course you can knit it cuff down. You just have to like think about it a little bit differently. So once I had finally figured it out, I was very excited, and it was really fun to publish a pattern, and also very stressful. I won't romanticize it. It is stressful to put something out there and have other people try to follow your instructions. And I checked everything a million times, but I'm always nervous that something's going to be wrong, especially because this ended up hitting the front page of Ravelry, which I could have never expected. That was such a cool experience. And it has almost 700 unique downloads at this point. And I don't really have like a reference point for what that means exactly, but that feels like a high number to me. So it was an exciting year, and I have to call these my favorite. This is another Shoppelval Zauberball. This is in the colorway 2516, and it is the Stark 6 one, so it's a sport weight. I knit these at 48 stitches. I started them August 3rd. I finished them October 7th, so it took me 65 days to knit these. The yarn cost me $30, and I love this colorway, so it's totally worth it. And this was 384 yards. Just a couple more knitting projects, and then I will get into some of the yarn that I spun. But this next project is the Weekend Headband by Petite Knit. I knit this during Knitmas, so you can watch it. You can watch me start this in one of my vlogs. I just needed a running headband. It's something that has been on my list to knit for the entire year, and I finally did at the end of it. I wanted to know if I could knit a headband for myself that I could actually feel comfortable running in. I really like cold weather running, so in 10 to 20 degree weather, I like to keep my ears warm when I'm running outside. And I had this pattern earmarked for this purpose for, like I said, the entire year. And I think overall, this was successful. It's fairly small, as you can see. I didn't want the band to be too wide, and I didn't want the circumference to be too wide, because it really needs to stay on my head while I'm running. Like, that's the biggest challenge with knitting something like this. And I haven't had a chance to run in it yet because it's been too warm, but when I do, I will report back. But it seems like it's going to work. Based on wearing it, it feels very snug on my head, but not too tight. I knit it out of wool. This is Blue Sky Fibers Woolstock Worsted that I had in my stash. I love this yarn. And I knit the smallest size. I actually really can't recommend this pattern. Don't buy this pattern. I feel like it's a bit of a waste of money because the way that you seam this doesn't really look nice. It's also just such a simple pattern, so I can't really recommend buying it, but I mean, it did the job. I did find a project on Ravelry where somebody changed the cast on and the grafting methods, and I just followed that, and I found that to be really nice. So instead of following the pattern, I cast on provisionally, and then I grafted the two sides in the middle here in rib. And like I said, there's that project where somebody outlined how to do this. I did not figure this out on my own. And the results are not great just because I actually had a hard time with that grafting. There's like a couple sections in here where I got it down, but I just kept messing it up, and I also just didn't really care because it's on the inside of the headband. It doesn't really matter, but since it is a paid pattern, I would have hoped that the designer would have like figured out how to make it look nice. I spent 3 days working on this in December, and honestly the hardest part was just the grafting. So if I were to make this again, I don't know if I would use that same technique. It looks really nice. I just had a hard time with it. I maybe just had a really busy, stressful month and my brain wasn't working to do this very well, but I didn't enjoy doing it. So I would probably either stick to the pattern and just accept that the rib isn't going to continue, or I don't know, find some other way to do it. But that is the Weekend Headband by Petite Knit. The yarn cost me $9 and this was 98 yards. And my last project of 2025, the gift socks that I didn't get done by Christmas and that I wasn't sure if I was gonna get done by the end of the year. But on New Year's Eve at like 10:30 p.m., I pulled through and I bound them off, and now I get to count them as an FO. These are the gift socks that I knit for my partner out of Lang socks, Lang Super Socks in the color Party Mix. This was a skein that he picked out. He also had a theme this year, if you can't tell. And I knit them as his Christmas gift. I knit him a pair of socks every Christmas, and usually I am late in finishing them. Maybe one year that will change. But I just used my Reverse Fleegle Heel. I think it looks really nice with this yarn. So I knit them cuff down, and they are a 2x2 rib, which took me a while because he has large feet. I think I started these December 1st or maybe the 2nd. I can't remember. I'll have to go rewatch my videos to find out because I forgot to put it in Ravelry. But if I started it December 1st, then it took me 21 days because I did bind them off on the 31st. This skein was $19.50, and these socks are 358 yards. It's a lot of 2x2 rib, but they do fit very well. And lastly, I spun a few additional skeins this year. The first is a skein from Nest Fiber. It is another one of her Fiber Club colorways. It's in the colorway Glad Tidings from 2023. And I already have it caked up and partially used because this is in a project at the moment. I'm using this in my tessellated vest, but I started this at the beginning of the year. I started this on February 12th. I finished it on the 17th. So it took me 5 days, and I spun this as a fractal, which is always fun. And it is a sport weight. It is a 2-ply, and this cost me $22 for the braid, and this is 261 yards spun. And I'm finishing it off with the yarn that I spun during Tour de Fleece. First, I spun long draw for the first time. This was sort of my long draw practice skein. This is from a Melly Knits batt. It is one of her Tuski batts, meaning it is sort of a bit of everything. It's like the odds and ends of what's left over as they make their batts. It is a really pretty gray with specks of a bunch of different colors. It is the squishiest yarn I've ever spun. I started this on July 5th. I finished it on the 13th, so it was a whip for 8 days, and I spent $40 on this batt. This is a 2-ply. It ended up being a little bit under 4 ounces, and it is 305 yards. And finally, my combo spin that I spun during Tour de Fleece. I only have 2 skeins of it. I spun 4 because the rest are being knit up into a sweater, but this was a really fun combo spin. I have project vlogs on me working on this. I started this July 5th and I finished September 23rd. Had kind of a busy July and August and maybe September, I guess. So it took me a little bit to finish, 80 days, but this was still the fastest sweater quantity that I have spun. It's my second time spinning for a sweater. And I added up all the braids. I used a total of 6 braids, different types of fiber, different colorways from different dyers. It's all listed out on my Ravelry, but I spent a total of $134 on this spin. And I spun a total of 1,548 yards, which is a lot. Here's another cake, and then here's the sweater that I'm currently knitting out of this yarn. It's really fun. I really like how this combo spin turned out. All right, to wrap it all up, I will go through some of my totals. So like I said at the start, I have a total of 15 knitted items. I knit 9,110 yards, which is a couple thousand yards fewer than last year, but significantly more than the year before. I feel like my goal is always to knit more than I did the previous year. At some point, I will hit a limit for sure of what I can knit in a year, but I do feel like I am able to knit more than 9,000 yards in a year. However, I do feel pretty good about what I was able to get done. I end up re-knitting a lot, so you know, if you count my total stitches, I definitely knit more than that, but that is what I completed this year. Oh, and I also spun 2,487 yards, which I thought was pretty fun to look at. I don't know if I have that stat for last year. I don't think I do, but it's definitely more than what I spun last year. And for a total project cost for 2025, I spent $915.50. Tracking the cost is a little bit new for me. I typically track my spending, but I don't necessarily track what each project costs me and then add it up at the end of the year, but that is something that I would like to start doing because I just find it interesting. I also find it interesting that one item was almost a third of my total cost for the year. I feel like I always have one really expensive item, you know? And the rest are a little bit more reasonable. So I'm definitely curious to find out what my project cost is next year. If I were to predict it, I think I will spend more money next year, like maybe quite a bit more money, because I would just like to do a lot more knitting. Plus I have some sweater quantities in my stash and I will include that as, you know, my project cost. So the total for this year is not necessarily what I spent this year. Although actually I think I bought most of the yarn this year for a specific project. Maybe some of my fiber was in stash, but anyway, that's the total for 2025. Thanks for sticking it out this long. I know these videos are so long, but I always really like them. And even though it's a lot of work, I really like to gather everything and just take a look at my year and kind of reflect on how my knitting went. It's a good opportunity to think about what I want to work on for next year. So more content will be coming, and I'll see you then.